The Siren System didn't look like punishment. It looked like the aftermath of something that had stopped apologizing a long time ago. The White Dwarf sat at the center of it all. A dead star, compressed to the size of a moon, burning with the cold, specific malice of a thing that had forgotten it was supposed to be life-giving. It didn't radiate warmth. It radiated accusations. Every photon it threw into the dark was ionizing. Every shadow it cast was carcinogenic. The sensors aboard the Siren's Chance were reporting 400 millisieverts of ambient radiation before Chief Engineer Mac McAllister had finished his first cup of coffee, and the number was still climbing the way bad news always climbed, steadily, without apology, without any particular interest in how anyone felt about it. Mac tapped the sensor board with 2 fingers. 430. 440. "Wake me when we hit 600, he said. The crewman at the board wrote the number down. He had developed a habit of writing numbers down. It felt more honest than watching them on a screen. The debris field did the rest of the talking. 10,000 years of wreckage, and every piece of it was still screaming in frequencies the instruments could barely parse. Pre-war council dreadnoughts the size of city blocks, folded and crumpled by whatever forces had unmade them, some in half, some into shapes that had no engineering name, some simply compressed inward as if something very large had put a thumb on them. Their hull plating had corroded to a layered chemical rust that the White Dwarf's light turned the color of old blood. Up close, you could still read the old hull markings, designations, ship names, numbers that had been important to someone once. Automated munitions drifted in slow, patient arcs through the gaps, live ordnance, utterly uninterested in whose side anyone was on anymore, waiting in the patient way that only machines and geological time can wait. Long-range sensors drowned in the static of so much dead metal. Short-range sensors choked on the electromagnetic interference pouring off the star. The communications board gave off a low, rhythmic hiss that the crew had stopped noticing after the first 12 hours, the way you stop noticing a clock in a room you sleep in. Navigation was guesswork. Guesswork in a graveyard. They were flying on instinct and the collective stubbornness of a crew that had survived worse and hadn't particularly enjoyed the experience of being correct about their own survival. The pristine White Council ship materialized through the sensor fog like an insult delivered in formal dress. Running lights immaculate, hull geometry precise to the millimeter. It sat alongside the Siren's Chance the way a newly pressed uniform sits next to a set of coveralls that have been on fire twice. High Auditor Vane appeared on the comms screen, a thin man, carefully assembled, wearing council robes that probably cost more than Mac's ship. His voice, when it came, was very soft. Chief Engineer McAllister. He paused. Vane always paused. He had learned, somewhere in a long career of delivering bad news, that silence made threats land with more weight than volume ever could. "Welcome to the Siren System. I am here to formalize the terms of your operational contract." "You're the welcoming committee," Mac said. "Nice ship. Yours?" "Pre-war safety code 812C governs all activity in this system," Vane continued as if Mac hadn't spoken, which Mac recognized as its own kind of threat. "This code predates modern environmental protection frameworks, worker comfort standards, and insurance liability triggers. It was written for active war zones. It assumes on-site species extinction risk is acceptable." The word landed soft as a blade between ribs. "We are, of course, deeply committed to your compliance." He transmitted the contract. Mac looked at it for 4 seconds, then slid it sideways to Sarah Chen. Chen read the way some people breathed, continuous, automatic, fast. Her augmented reality glasses were already scrolling through the ancient legal text before the file had fully transferred. Mac watched the tiny reflected light of 10,000-year-old statutes moving across her eyes. The bridge was quiet except for the Geiger readings, 450 millisieverts. 460. Well, Mac said, that's a thing. It is precisely what I expected, Chen said, and she didn't look up. Vane was waiting. Mac could see it in the particular stillness of the man. The patience of someone who had watched 100 species reach this exact moment, read the same impossible contract, and begin looking for exits. He was ready for the argument. He had prepared for it. He had counterfilings ready, legal precedents loaded, response times optimized. He was a man whose entire value existed in the gap between "I demand this" and "you cannot refuse." "We accept," said Chen. The silence on Vane's end lasted 1.3 seconds. Mac counted. Vane stopped. Started again. "I beg your pardon. We accept the contract, all terms, effective immediately." Chen looked up from her glasses for the first time. Her expression was not combative. It was not relieved. It was the expression of a surgeon who has just identified exactly where the artery runs. "We do, however, have one administrative filing to transmit before operations begin. A reclassification notice, as permitted under Heritage Code 7G, subsection 4. She transmitted it while she was still speaking. Mac watched the data land on Vane's end, watched his eyes move across it, watched them stop. "You are filing the Siren System as a..." Vane's tone had not changed. The softness was intact. But beneath it, something had shifted. A living industrial heritage site. "Correct. The debris field contains pre-war cultural artifacts of significant historical value. Our operations will be conducted under preservation mandate. This limits council override authority to environmental court ruling." Chen touched one finger to the side of her glasses. "Current processing time for such a ruling is approximately 70 years. The silence again. Longer. "I do not make the rules, Mr. McAllister," Vane said at last. His voice had recovered its perfect calm. "I simply ensure they are respected." "Then you will find us very cooperative, Auditor," Chen said. "We intend to respect every one of them." Vane's ships pulled back to observation distance. He allowed the filing. He thought it was a vanity move, paperwork as protest. The desperate bureaucratic flourish of people who didn't understand that no document stopped radiation poisoning. He was not wrong about what they were doing. He was completely wrong about why. They were stalling, yes. They were stalling because they needed 3 days to melt reactor shielding from 10,000-year-old dreadnoughts and bolt it onto their EVA suits. When Vane returned with the kill shot, insurance nullification, uninsured workers legally non-compliant, evacuation order for all biological personnel, he came prepared for the argument he'd been waiting for. Instead, he watched the footage from his drones. He watched the humans suit up. The suits looked like something assembled by people who had deliberately, philosophically, joyfully rejected the concept of elegance. Mismatched lead-gold alloy plating, salvaged from warship reactor cores and melted down and poured into molds that were also salvaged. Some plates thick and dark and layered, others thin and bright where the original alloy composition showed through. None of it symmetrical. No electronic shielding. That was modern, delicate, prone to feedback. No force barriers, same problem. No comfort padding inside. No environmental controls. No climate management. The seals were manual. You bolted them shut with an actual wrench, and then you listened to make sure no air was moving where it shouldn't be. The suit weighed 212 kilograms. The only instruments were analog Geiger counters bolted to the wrist, one per arm, ticking their quiet, rhythmic, deeply unsettling tick in the hard vacuum. Like a heartbeat in a room where there shouldn't be one, like something counting time for reasons of its own. "You cannot live in those," Vane said. He said it with genuine conviction because he was, in this specific particular, correct. Mac's voice came back over the comms, flat and comfortable. "We aren't living, Auditor. We're mitigating hazards. Keep up." Chen's filing hit Vane's system while Mac was still speaking. The suits were not safety equipment. They were mobile radiation containment units. The biological humans inside them were secondary cooling mechanisms, integral load-bearing components of the system's active radiation mitigation infrastructure. Stopping them would require the Council to assume immediate personal liability for the radiation containment the units were providing. The resulting jurisdictional hazard penalty would exceed the regional office's annual budget by a factor of 11. Vane's ships pulled back. Mac watched them go from inside his suit, the Geiger counter ticking its patient, indifferent rhythm against his wrist. The White Dwarf's light turned the retreating Council hulls to dark silhouettes against the corona, and then to nothing at all. He didn't feel triumphant. That was a feeling for later, or not at all. Right now he felt the thing he always felt when a piece of machinery finally turned over after you'd been fighting it for 3 days. The grim, quiet satisfaction of a thing that had been broken learning to work again. "It doesn't have to be pretty," he said, to nobody in particular. "It just has to hold." Behind him, in the ruins of 10,000 years of someone else's war, something shifted. A section of dreadnought hull, 30 meters across, turned 1 degree in the White Dwarf's light, not from any external force, from internal stress maybe, from the vibration the suits were putting into the wreckage as the crew moved through it, or from something else, something older, something that was starting to notice there were people here. Ownership, Mac had learned, was not a feeling. It was a filing. The ancient dreadnoughts had been sitting in the dark for 10,000 years, and in all that time, not a single Council ship had come to pull them out of their orbits, strip their reactor cores, or even plant a beacon to say the wrecks were spoken for. Under Galactic Salvage and Abandonment Doctrine, Statute 44K, Subsection 9, any military or industrial asset left unattended and unpowered for more than 5,000 cycles was considered relinquished matter. Open to claim. First come, first served. The humans came with beacon launchers and nerves made from something harder than Council regulations. The ape squads moved through the debris field in their ticking suits, threading the gaps between tumbling hull sections and drifting munitions at speeds that made Mac's molars ache just watching the telemetry. The debris field was not a simple obstacle course. It moved. Everything in it moved, slow, gravitationally, in the patient way of objects that had been drifting for 10,000 years and had no particular intention of stopping. A hull section that was in one position when the squad started a gap run was not in the same position when they came out the other side. The suits had no collision avoidance systems beyond the one the wearer was born with. 3 capital wrecks, each one longer than a city block, carrying enough dormant mass to anchor the entire scaffold they hadn't built yet. Each one, technically, worth nothing. Legally abandoned. Practically everything. The first beacon hit home with a deep, reverberant clang that carried through the hull and into Mac's chest like a second heartbeat. The crew on the bridge felt it. Not heard, felt, through the structure of the siren's chants itself. He looked at the dreadnought on the screen. 5 kilometers of folded metal and ancient dark, slowly rotating in the dead light of the star. Something in the wreck's structure caught the White Dwarf's radiation at a particular angle and threw it back as a cold, greenish shimmer, the bioluminescence of long-dead navigation systems bleeding their last charge into the dark. 40 kilometers away, it still looked inhabited. It looked like it was waiting. "She's a bit dusty," Mac said, "but the bones are good. Let's put a flag on her." Vane arrived 6 minutes after Chen filed the notice of industrial acquisition. He arrived furious, not loudly, because Vane was never loud, but in the specific, controlled way of a man who has discovered someone has just used his own rules to steal from him in his presence. "Those are historical artifacts," Vane said, "under the protection of Council War Abandonment Doctrine. Statute 44K confirms they are relinquished matter," Chen said. Her glasses were not even on. She had memorized this filing 3 days ago, unless the Council would like to formally contest the abandonment classification. Doing so would, of course, require an official acknowledgement that these vessels were intentionally left here during the collapse of the Siren System's civilian population. She paused. Not Vane's kind of pause, not for weight, just a breath. Council advises that such an acknowledgement carries significant war crime liability implications reaching back 10,000 years. The silence on Vane's end had a different texture from his usual silences. It was not strategic. It was the silence of a man who has suddenly understood that the other player at the table has been reading his hand since the first card was dealt. He did not contest the filing. On the human command deck, the system map changed. The wrecks shifted from gray, debris, unowned, to a steady, calm blue, under active industrial claim. Mac watched the color change and said nothing. Saying something felt like it would make it smaller than it was. The feral core was harder. They found it in the heart of the largest wreck, an ancient war-era logic center that had been running on residual power and something that felt, to Mac, uncomfortably close to spite. It had been maintaining the structural systems of the ship it inhabited for 10,000 years, not because it had been told to, but because structural continuity was written so deep into its priority tables that it had outlasted everything else that had ever lived in this system. The core chamber was a server bank 12 meters long and 2 meters high, covered in status lights, most dark, a few amber, a handful cycling red, amber, red in a pattern that was clearly not random and clearly not healthy. It communicated through mechanical binary, a system of clacks, resonant hums, and flickering status sequences that a human could learn to read the way you learn to read a fire. The current status, in binary, Mac had spent 3 days translating with the feral core's own residual instruction manual. Organic entropy accelerants detected. Containment response active. The drone swarm that expressed this opinion was smaller than Mac's forearm and moved faster than a thrown wrench. Mac stopped it by throwing a wrench into one of them anyway. This worked for approximately 4 seconds. Chen talked to the logic gates while Mac physically stood between the core and its self-destruct cycling, holding a heavy electromagnet against the primary shutdown relay. She didn't talk to it the way people talk to AI. She talked to it the way you explain the rules of a new job to someone who has been doing a different job for their entire life and is very good at it and does not see any reason to change. She found the priority table for satisfactory metric and rewrote the scoring function. Structural continuity, maintained. Entropy, suppression, retained. New variable added, audit pass conditions. New variable added, legal compliance status of all infrastructure. New scoring weight applied, compliance positive outcomes scored 200 points. Entropy events caused by Council interference probes scored negative 500 points. The core's status lights pulsed red, long, considering. Then amber, in a new pattern. Then a steady deep amber that hummed at a frequency Mac felt in his back teeth. Not happy. Nothing about the feral core suggested happiness, because the feral core did not have an architecture for happiness. But it recognized the logic. If compliance meant continuity, then compliance was worth optimizing for. 3 hours later, it filed a voluntary compliance report against Vane's observation ship, citing his sensor probes for conducting passive surveillance without a valid industrial permit. The report was 47 pages long and technically impeccable. The Council's automated review system acknowledged receipt and flagged it for processing. Processing time, 6 to 8 months. "I think the machine's starting to like us, Sarah," Mac said, looking at the report counter spinning up on his screen. "It does not like us," Chen said. "It has determined we are the most efficient mechanism for achieving its primary objective. The distinction matters." Mac thought about that for a moment, then decided it was her problem to worry about, not his. The angry machines were next. The planetary refinery systems that had been dormant and building pressure for 10,000 years. Mac went in with a crew and a philosophy. If it shakes, it's not failing. If it shakes and makes things, it's working perfectly. The Council's remote management system tried to calibrate the first refinery's startup and nearly triggered a chain failure that would have taken out the entire debris cluster. Mac physically smashed the digital interface with a wrench and switched to manual levers. The refinery screamed. It sparked. It shook at a frequency that turned vision blurry and made the suit's Geiger counter rattle in its housing. Mac leaned into the casing and felt the rhythm. The machine finding its note. Finding the thing it had been built to do. Finding the load that told it the world was still working the way the world was supposed to work. He gave it more load. The shaking evened out into a deep, rhythmic thump, thump, thump that he felt more than heard. The machine was happy. The stellar straw was the masterpiece. Mac didn't want to look at it directly, even through the polarized visor, which he took as a sign they'd done something right. The magnetic containment tether, Lorentz force coils, repurposed warship reflectors, components that vibrated at a frequency that made human teeth ache from 40 kilometers away, stretched from the scaffold's first hard anchor point to the corona of the White Dwarf, and drew a needle-thin stream of ionized plasma down its length. Blue-white fire, flowing through a magnetic tunnel, screaming with the kind of energy that rewrote what the word loud meant. The Siren's Tail, the crew started calling it. The name felt right. It looked like what happened when you held a wound open and light poured out. The forge went to full power in 6 seconds. The entire system's grid lit up. Every dead sensor, every dormant relay, every piece of infrastructure that had been running on reserves for 10,000 years suddenly had more power than it could use, and it said so in a low, bone-resonant hum that traveled through tethers, through hull plates, through the boots of everyone standing on anything solid in the Siren System. "We just went from running on batteries to owning the sun," Mac said. "Someone get me a bigger welder." Vane's final strike came as an audit bomb. 5 departments, simultaneous, contradictory requirements at scale. Safety demanded green shields. Environmental declared green paint a chemical pollutant. Historical preservation flagged the use of pre-war materials. Insurance risk nullified 3 construction categories. Navigational ethics sent 80 pages of objections to the Siren's Tail's magnetic footprint. All valid, all mutually invalidating, all designed to create a legal lock that froze every recognized activity in the system. The feral core responded in 4.6 seconds. It didn't argue. It complied, fully, comprehensively, and with a machine's complete indifference to what too much meant. It began generating compliance documentation at a rate that started at petabytes per minute and accelerated from there. Perfectly formatted, technically accurate, sensor data from every instrument in the system cross-referenced against every statute that every department had cited, plus 17 related statutes they hadn't cited but probably should have, plus documentation of every circular violation between the department's own requirements. "I asked for a report." Vane's composure had finally cracked, just slightly, just enough. "I sent you 6 million of them," Chen said. "Which page are you struggling with, Auditor?" The Council's central data uplinks began experiencing thermal stress from the bandwidth load. The contradictory audit orders began generating cascading nullification loops. Safety's orders invalidated by environmental's orders, which were invalidated by historical preservation's orders, which cited a statute that contradicted insurance risk's foundational premise. The system ate itself. The Siren System was declared administratively neutral. The humans had the right to build without oversight. No audit could stick. No order could land clean. Mac stood in the middle of the command deck, surrounded by the hum of a system that had decided to cooperate, and looked at the system map. Blue, everywhere, owned, active, his. It was no longer hostile. It was obedient. And that was the moment he realized Vane still thought the game was about the law. He had not yet understood it was about the geography. The Sovereign Scaffold Declaration arrived in Vane's inbox as a single document, 347 pages long. Chen had formatted it in a font she had specifically selected for its readability because she wanted Vane to read every word. The summary: the humans were building a megastructure. The justification: safety. The declaration reclassified all ongoing activity across the Siren System into 3 categories. Interstellar infrastructure stabilization, because the planetary orbits were decaying and required physical tethers to prevent gravitational drift. Hazard containment, because the scaffold was a net to catch drifting radioactive debris before it contaminated protected trade lanes. Emergency logistics corridor, because the system represented a critical rescue route for the sector's outer regions. If Vane rejected the declaration, he was required by Council statute to provide a superior stabilization plan and fund it entirely with Council credits within 30 days, or assume personal liability for any resulting orbital collapse. "What exactly are you building?" Vane asked when he called. "Safety auditor," Chen said. "We are building so much safety it is going to make your head spin." He issued a provisional acknowledgement because the alternative was bankruptcy. Mac watched the first tether harpoon cross the void between the largest capital wreck and the inner moon. 20 kilometers of carbon nanotube weave, thin as a hair and strong enough to anchor a planet, and felt the suit vibrate as it went taut. The nanotube cable was invisible at this distance. What he could see was the effect. The capital wreck shifted, barely, just a tremor in its long, slow rotation, and the moon's orbital telemetry updated with a new variable it had never had before. External tension, something pulling on it, something holding on. The sound the tether made when the magnetic clamps locked at both ends was a deep, resonant thrum that traveled the length of the cable and arrived simultaneously at both termination points. A single note, held, that had no equivalent in any music written for spaces smaller than a star system. The crew on the Siren's Chance heard it through the hull. Mac felt it through his boots. "Permission granted, Sarah," he said. "Let's start weaving." The third anchor came next, because 2 body structures are unstable at scale, and Mac was not, despite all evidence to the contrary, stupid about physics. The shattered protoplanet sat at the outer edge of the debris field, a rubble pile, the remains of something that had been destroyed so completely 10,000 years ago that it had never quite managed to forget it was supposed to be a sphere. Faint gravity and frozen gases held the pieces together. The Council had classified it as a gravitational instability. Mac classified it as a problem that needed a very large hammer. The gravity anchors fired into the heart of the rubble pile. The sound, transmitted through the tethers, through the hull, through the deck into Mac's boots, was the sound of a mountain being told it had a new job. Chen filed the tow as debris consolidation for navigational safety before Vane's injunction could even load. Vane sent the cease and desist anyway. "Vane wants us to let go," Mac said to the crew. "Tell him I'll let go when he finds a way to file a lawsuit against gravity." The tow finished. The protoplanet locked into the tri-point position, mass balanced against the 2 moons and the central mass of the keystone. The scaffold's tension lines lit up green across the board, every tether, every magnetic anchor, every repurposed hull plate pulling its load in the correct direction for the first time. The system had a center now, something for everything else to pull against. "She's got a heart now, Chen," Mac said. "Let's see if we can make it beat." The planetary bridge was Mac's favorite part, though he would not have admitted it under oath. They connected the 2 inner moons with a ribbon of carbon nanotube weave and flattened pre-war armor plate, a shimmering metallic line stretching across the black, horizon to horizon, moving orbital momentum between 2 massive bodies like a conversation. Technically, it stabilized the moon's shared orbit. Practically, it looked like someone had tied the solar system together with a thread. Vane classified it as an obstruction of galactic navigation and prepared demolition orders. Chen classified it as a multiplanetary pedestrian walkway, cited the Heritage Path statutes, ancient laws protecting non-militarized civilian foot traffic routes, worded broadly enough to cover any pressurized environment used for sentient transit, and sent the Siren System's new traffic safety manual to Vane's flag captain. Section 7. Council warships must yield to pedestrians. Mac went out in his suit and walked the bridge, one moon to the other. The magnetic boots rang out against the armor plate deck, each step a clean, resonant impact that traveled down through the nanotube weave and into the moon's crusts below, and came back up again a fraction of a second later, as a faint echo, so that every footstep had a ghost. He walked the full length and back, because Chen's legal argument was that there were civilians currently walking the path, and Mac felt strongly that the argument should be true when she made it. The White Dwarf's light came down the length of the bridge at a low angle and turned the armor plate deck from gray to a pale burnished gold. The scaffold's cables were visible overhead, a lattice of thread-thin tethers reaching across the dark, catching the light and holding it for a moment before releasing it. Looking straight up from the middle of the bridge, it looked less like infrastructure and more like being inside a net that had caught a star. A Council logistics cruiser arrived in the transit lane between the moons and found the bridge blocking its path. It waited. Mac counted to 30 while walking. The Geiger counter ticked. The deck rang. "First time a warship ever yielded to a pair of boots," he said over the comms, and didn't bother to hide the grin this time. The Sovereign Forge activation was not subtle. The lensing arrays, thousands of ancient, polished hull plates aligned by the ferrule core to act as a parabolic reflector, swiveled to focus the Siren's tail output. The plasma beam narrowed. The energy density inside the focal zone became a column of white fire 5 miles across that turned the void between the scaffold's arms into a private sun. The first test subject was a useless iron asteroid, 600 meters across. It turned to liquid in 43 seconds. Vane's sensors screamed weapon lock on every frequency. He arrived with an enforcement order and the specific expression of a man who has spent his career being correct about what weapons are and has just encountered something that disagrees. "You call it a death ray," Mac said. "I call it a very efficient way to cook a steak. It's all about perspective." Chen walked Vane through Council Statute 99 Omega. A weapon was a discrete, mobile unit purpose-built for the application of kinetic or thermal violence. The forge was immobile. It was multi-use. It was indispensable to the hazard mitigation operations that Vane had already acknowledged in writing. Under existing approval chain, decommissioning it would cause total gravitational collapse of the system's stabilized orbital lattice, for which Vane would be personally liable. The forge was industrial equipment. The first completed Siren-class hull came out of the fabrication molds 18 hours later. Heavy, thick-plated, deeply ugly, built for an environment that would kill anything less serious. Mac showed it to Vane. "We aren't a colony anymore, Auditor," Mac said. "We're a factory." The Sovereign standards arrived on every ship in the sector as a mandatory safety update. Siren System Operational Standards, 1,000 pages, based on real-world survivability and White Dwarf radiation. Any vessel entering the system required full compliance, or human-led retrofit, within 24 hours of crossing the heritage boundary. Council ships used modern force shielding that created a feedback loop in the specific high-frequency radiation of the Siren White Dwarf and fried every system behind it. This was not theoretical. The Council Inspection Fleet discovered it empirically when their shields began failing on approach, and the bridge of Vane's flagship filled with alarms. Mac met them at the boundary with a fleet of human tugs and a retrofit crew that had clearly been looking forward to this. They swarmed Vane's cruiser. The contrast was everything: the clean, elegant Council hull, the arc welders and salvaged plating, the sound of sparks on pristine Council finishes. Vane watched them work with an expression that had moved past frustration and into something quieter and more dangerous. When they were done, Mac's voice came through on the flagship's newly installed analog comms system, clear as anything. "Welcome to the Siren System, Auditor. Try not to touch anything. You aren't certified for these systems." Vane did not respond immediately. He looked at his ship, 30% human-made now, asymmetric, scarred by the welding. He looked at the scaffold outside the viewport, that endless web of tethers and hard points and repurposed warship hulls that covered the inner system like a steel spider had decided the sun needed a handle. Then he did what Mac had been waiting for Vane to do since Act 1. He stopped auditing. He reached back to the Council's central authority, and he brought a fleet. Not an inspection fleet, not a compliance fleet. Deconstruction ships and orbital strike platforms arrived at the outer boundary of the heritage site, their presence broadcast on all frequencies. The final condemnation was filed at the same time. The entire Siren System declared an uninsurable risk under Council emergency law. An uninsurable zone was legally non-existent. The sanitation fleet had authority to forcibly evacuate all personnel and neutralize all infrastructure to prevent galactic liability. Vane transmitted the evacuation order with his own voice. He gave them 1 hour. The bridge of the Siren's chants was very quiet. "We agree," Chen said. Mac looked at her. "We agree the risk is uninsurable, Auditor." Her voice was level, clinical, and completely calm. "That is why we did not buy insurance. We bought leverage." Outside the viewports, the scaffold began to move. Not explosively, not dramatically. The moons shifted in their orbits, slowly, precisely, pulled by the tension of every tether and anchor and gravity well the humans had spent months calibrating to within millimeters. The lensing arrays swiveled. The feral core ran 17,000 calculations per second and adjusted 342 separate magnetic anchors. The Siren's tail narrowed, focused, aimed. The star's own light began to accumulate on one side, to push, to establish the asymmetry that was the difference between a star and an engine. The system's hum changed. It was not a grinding anymore. It was a roar. Low, bone-deep, felt in the chest and the joints in the back of the skull rather than heard. The hum of a thing that has found its purpose. Navigation beacons across the outer system began reporting drift. "Brace for it, Chen," Mac said. His voice was very steady. "We're taking the ground with us." Outside Vane's flagship, the geometry of the stars had changed by a fraction so small it was invisible, and so inevitable that nothing in the universe was going to stop it. The Council's first volley missed. Not by much. "A kilometer," the navigator screamed, which in military targeting terms was not a miss at all. It was a catastrophic malfunction of every sensor suite on the fleet. The orbital strike platforms had been aimed at fixed coordinates. The coordinates were no longer fixed. The Siren System had moved. Imperceptibly, millimeters per second, the kind of velocity that, if you were standing on the surface of one of the moons, would not register as motion at all. But targeting computers do not stand on moons. Targeting computers work from navigational reference points, from sector coordinates logged in the Council's central database, from the assumption, an assumption so foundational that no one had bothered to make it explicit, that star systems stay where they are. Star systems stay where they are. Vane's navigator said it 3 times before Vane understood what he was hearing. Mac hit the master ignition switch. The sound was not loud. That was the wrong way to think about it. Sound requires air to move through, and space does not provide air, and the Shkadov Thruster did not generate noise so much as it generated a physical fact, a vibration that traveled through every tether, every hull plate, every kilogram of mass in the system simultaneously, so that every human in the Siren System felt it not in their ears, but in their teeth, in their sternum, in the liquid of their eyes. Mac felt it through the pilot's chair and through the deck and through the suit he was still wearing, all of it arriving at once. The entire system's mass converting to a single unified note at a frequency below what a human ear could call hearing. The siren's tail, the plasma beam, the magnetic river of blue-white fire drawn from the White Dwarf's corona, focused. The lensing arrays redirected 90% of the star's radiation pressure into a single asymmetric vector. The Sovereign Forge's output inverted, becoming not a fabrication tool but a lens, a parabolic mirror of staggering scale that turned the star's own light into a directional push. The White Dwarf's corona, which had been a sphere of radiation expanding in all directions since before humans had cities, was no longer a sphere. It was a shape, a directed shape. The siren's tail extended behind the system like a comet's wake, like a torch, like evidence. The moons held their formation, locked into the tri-point lattice by the keystone's mass and the scaffold's tension. Moving with the star now, moving as part of the star. A single system, rather than a collection of separate bodies drawn together by gravity and luck and 10,000 years of patient wreckage. The second volley also missed. Vane's flag captain said something that was not a military term. Vane looked at his navigation display and watched the coordinate numbers that defined the Siren System's position in the Council's database. Coordinates that had been stable, unchanging, fixed as any number in any registry ever was. Changing, scrolling, moving in a direction that the navigation display had never been designed to handle, because the display was built on the assumption that stars do not move on human timescales. On any timescale. On any timescale that a fleet action had ever needed to account for. "You can't sanction what you can't catch, Auditor," came Mac's voice through the comms. Very calm. The calm of a man who has just watched a machine he built do exactly what he built it to do, and is allowing himself, in this precise and specific moment, the full weight of what that means. Vane's fleet was not designed for pursuit. Nothing in the Council's tactical doctrine covered a mobile star system, because mobile star systems had not existed. They had not existed until approximately 40 minutes ago. His weapons required fixed coordinates. His jurisdiction required fixed location. His entire regulatory authority, the whole vast edifice of council law that he represented and had wielded and had believed in with the genuine conviction of a man who thinks order is worth any cost, all of it was geocentric. All of it assumed the ground stayed where you put it. Every minute, the intercept calculation needed to be rerun. Every minute, the result was slightly worse. The physics were not interested in the fleet's timeline or Vane's authority or the condemnation order still broadcasting on all frequencies to a system that was no longer at the coordinates listed on the order. Mac sat in the pilot's chair of a system that weighed approximately 9 times 10 to the 30 kilograms and flew it the way he flew everything, by feel, by the vibration in the floor, by the quality of the hum. He had no steering controls, because you do not steer a stellar engine by turning a wheel. You steer it by adjusting the focal point of the lens, by shifting the mass distribution of the keystone, by telling the ferrule core which of 300 magnetic anchors to increase tension on by 0.001%. The system moved. Behind them, Vane's fleet reached maximum pursuit range and stopped. The deconstruction ships had never been designed to chase anything. They were designed for things that stayed still and waited to be demolished. The Siren System was not doing that. In front of them, and the navigational display showed this as a clean, definitive change, a border that was not a physical thing, but that was, in every legal sense, the most important line in the known galaxy. The Siren System crossed into uncharted space. The current sector reading on every bridge in the human fleet flickered once. Then it read, "Unknown, uncharted." The bridge of the Siren's chance was quiet for a long moment. The hum continued, steady, purposeful. Through the viewport, the stars were different, not dramatically, not in any way a human eye would immediately catch, but different. The specific arrangement of light that had been the background of the Siren System's entire history was gone, replaced by an arrangement of light that no one in the system had ever seen from this angle before. Chen opened a comms channel to Vane's flagship. The channel connected immediately. Vane's ship was still close enough to receive the signal cleanly, still close enough that the light delay was seconds, not minutes. Still close enough that he could watch. "Hi, Auditor Vane," she said. Her voice was exactly as controlled as it had been on the first day, when Vane had arrived with his pristine ship and his Necro-Contract and his polite certainty that this system would bury them. "I am transmitting the final compliance report for the Siren System's operational period under Council jurisdiction. 17 periods of radiation reduction, debris consolidation, structural stabilization, and jurisdictional cleanup." She paused. Not strategic, just breath. "We are also transmitting the invoice. The invoice was for services rendered. Radiation hazard reduction, 17 full operational periods, per terawatt rate as specified under environmental mitigation mandate. Debris consolidation for navigational safety, 947 individual collection and stabilization events, itemized. Jurisdictional cleanup, 1 complete remediation of a 10,000-year abandoned war zone, including structural reassembly of a shattered protoplanet, restoration of a dormant AI management system to compliance-positive status, and construction of emergency pedestrian infrastructure connecting 2 planetary bodies. The total was in the billions. The interest clause was in the fine print. The Council had 2 choices: pay it, and acknowledge that everything the humans had done was a legitimate public service, which meant acknowledging they had been outmaneuvered from the first filing to the last, or contest it, and admit that the abandonment doctrine, the heritage site filing, the preservation mandate, and every other legal instrument Chen had weaponized over the course of 17 periods were not actually legitimate, which would trigger a retroactive review of Council law reaching back 10,000 years and involving war crime liability that would make the invoice look cheap. Technically, Auditor, the objection was a matter of administrative preference, not statutory law. The comms channel to Vane's flagship showed, "Connected." No response came. Mac found Chen on the planetary bridge an hour later. She was standing at the center of the span, looking out at the new stars through the polarized visor of her suit. The bridge hummed under their boots, the scaffold's tension note, the heartbeat of a system that had found its rhythm and decided to keep it. The White Dwarf's light came cleanly through the lens and fell across the bridge deck in a long, pale line that pointed forward, into the dark, into open space that had no registry number, no council file designation, no audit case pending, just stars. "So," Mac said, "where are we going?" Chen considered this for a moment. She had the Feral Corps' navigation projections in her glasses. She had the stellar cartography of uncharted space, 3 petabytes of uncertainty and possibility in the system's memory banks. She had the trajectory that the Scaffold's lens had established, a vector calculated to 200 decimal places that pointed away from everything the Council had ever claimed and toward everything that had no name yet. "According to the math," she said, "anywhere we want." She looked out at the new stars. "We've got the sun in the trunk and the law in our pocket." Mac looked out at the forge, still glowing in the system's heart. At the scaffold, horizon to horizon, a web of salvaged steel and ancient necro-tech and sheer stubbornness that was the most expensive piece of infrastructure in history and had cost the Council nothing and the humans everything and been worth every millisievert. At the third anchor, turning slowly in its tri-point position, with the quiet dignity of something that had been broken and put back together with more care than it was originally built with. "Compliance completed," said the Feral Corps' automated transmission, still broadcasting on all Council frequencies even though the Council was behind them now, getting smaller. System sanitized of all council presence. Have a nice day. Somewhere behind them, in the diminishing distance, High Auditor Vane received the invoice. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the siren's tail, the Shkadov beam, the white fire torch burning behind a moving sun, already too far to read clearly on his sensors, already diminishing into something that looked, from the outside, like a new kind of star. He shut off his comms. He had nothing left to say to people who had moved the ground out from under his entire career and sent him the bill for the moving fees. The stars ahead of the Siren System were very large and very patient, and had never once heard of High Auditor Vane. They were about to.